They abandoned me, thinking I was powerless. But they forgot one small detail. I had already planned my silent revenge. And when it unfolded, it left them empty-handed and speechless. I still remember the exact day as if it were carved into stone. The calendar read, March 14th, 2012, a Wednesday in Manchester. It was one of those gray mornings that never seemed to brighten, no matter how long you wait for the sun to peek through the clouds. My bones felt heavier than usual, but I told myself it was just age creeping in. At 73, you learn to accept aches as part of the routine. What I couldn't accept, what I never imagined, was that my own flesh and blood would decide that I was no longer worth the trouble. I had lived in the same modest terraced house for over 40 years. The one Margaret and I bought just after we married. She loved that house, red bricks, a little garden patch in the back, and a narrow hallway where our son Richard used to race toy cars. Margaret had passed away 7 years earlier, but every corner still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume. That house was not just bricks and mortar. It was memory. It was family. Or at least, it was supposed to be. That morning, Richard came by with Claire, his wife, and my granddaughter Emily. I thought it was just another ordinary visit. Maybe a bit rushed, because Richard always seemed busy with work. He worked in finance and liked to remind me how complicated his schedule was, as though I had never known the pressure of long hours when I worked at the Liverpool docks. I put the kettle on, ready to make tea, and pulled out the tin of biscuits Margaret had always kept stocked. But Richard didn't sit down. He didn't even take off his coat. Claire hovered behind him, her arms crossed tightly, her lips pursed in that way that made her look permanently dissatisfied. Emily was scrolling on her phone, thumbs tapping away, as though I weren't even there. That was the moment I felt something sink in my chest. Visits used to mean laughter, the smell of tea, and stories around the kitchen table. This was different, Dad, Richard began, his voice clipped, as if he had rehearsed what he was about to say. We need to talk. Now, when someone starts with those 4 words, you know nothing good follows. I nodded, trying to keep my face calm. You can't keep living like this, he continued, his eyes scanning the living room as though the peeling wallpaper and the old carpet were proof of my incompetence. It's not safe for you. You're alone, and it's too much responsibility. I felt a flash of anger. Too much responsibility. Richard, I've lived here since before you were born. I raised you here. I looked after your mother here. I've managed just fine. Claire stepped forward then, her voice sharp. It's not about whether you think you're managing. It's about reality. You're not young anymore. What happens if you fall? What happens if you forget to switch off the stove? You could burn the place down. You need to be practical. I stared at her. Practical. That word always sounded so cold when it came from her lips. Practical meant stripping away warmth, memory, humanity, leaving only efficiency. I'm fine, I said quietly. This is my home. I'm not leaving. But Richard avoided my eyes. His hand rested on Emily's shoulder, though she didn't even look up from her phone. We've already arranged it, he said finally. There's a place in Leeds, a home. They'll take good care of you. It's better this way. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. A home, a nursing home. Without asking me, my heart thudded in my chest like a hammer striking an anvil. You've arranged it, I repeated, my voice trembling. You've decided this for me. Richard sighed, as if I were the child and he the parent. Dad, you don't understand. We can't always be here for you. We have our own lives, our own responsibilities. Emily's in university soon. Claire's got enough on her plate. You'll be better off surrounded by people your own age, professionals who know how to deal with, well, with everything. With everything. That phrase cut me deeper than he could imagine. To him, I was no longer his father, no longer the man who had worked double shifts to pay for his education, no longer the one who stayed awake all night when he was sick as a boy. To him, I was a burden, a collection of problems to be outsourced. I don't want this, I whispered. But they had already made up their minds. Claire checked her watch impatiently, and Richard gave me a look that mixed pity and irritation. It's for the best, he said. You'll see. And then, Just like that, they left. No tea, no biscuits, no laughter. They walked out the same door Margaret used to stand by, waiting for me to come home from work, her arms open wide. Now it closed with a hollow thud that seemed to echo in every room. I sat in silence for a long time after they were gone. The kettle whistled on the stove until the water boiled away. The biscuits remained unopened on the table. And I, a man who had given everything for his family, sat there abandoned in the home that was once filled with love. It felt as though the walls themselves were grieving with me. The photographs on the mantel, Richard in his school uniform, Margaret in her wedding dress, Emily as a baby, seemed to stare down in judgment. Had I failed them somehow? Had I been too stern, too quiet, too old? But as the hours passed and the silence deepened, something inside me shifted. It was not an explosion of rage, not tears of despair, but something colder, steadier. A seed of resolve planted itself in my heart. They thought I was weak, helpless, a man to be stored away like an old coat no longer in use. They believed they had stripped me of dignity, of choice. They were wrong. That day, the day they walked away, was the day I began to understand that silence could be more powerful than words, that patience could be sharper than any blade. I did not shout after them. I did not beg them to reconsider. I simply sat, listening to the empty house breathe, and decided that if they had abandoned me, then I would no longer spend my remaining years giving them everything. I had something they did not know, something Margaret had always told me to hold on to, and in that moment, I knew what I must do. But that is another part of the story. After Richard and his family left that day, I sat alone in my chair, staring at the photographs on the mantelpiece. Each frame seemed to speak back to me, whispering stories of the life I had lived and, more importantly, the things I had given up along the way. It's funny, isn't it? You don't realize the weight of your sacrifices until those you made them for turn their backs on you. That's when the ghosts come walking in, each one carrying a memory, reminding you of all the pieces of yourself you laid down for others. I thought first of my younger years, back when my hands were strong, and my back hadn't yet curved under the years of labor. I started working at the Liverpool docks when I was just 17. My father had been a dock worker too, and though he warned me it was a hard life, I was proud to follow in his footsteps. The smell of salt and iron, the groan of ships, the clang of chains, those sounds became the rhythm of my youth. I worked shifts that stretched from dawn until the last bit of daylight slipped away. There was no glamour in it, no prestige, but there was dignity. Every crate I hauled, every rope I tied, was a promise that one day my family would have something better. When Margaret and I married, I swore she would never have to worry about the roof over our heads or food on the table. That vow became the compass of my entire life. And yet, in choosing that path, I gave up other things, dreams I hardly admitted even to myself. I once thought of becoming a teacher. I loved books, though I rarely had the time for them. I used to imagine standing in front of a classroom, chalk in hand, opening young minds to the beauty of words and history. But dreams are fragile things when survival presses on your shoulders. The docks paid the bills, and teaching was a fantasy we couldn't afford. Still, I never resented it. How could I? Every choice I made was for Richard. I remember the first time I held him in my arms. He was so small, wrapped in a blue blanket Margaret had knitted herself. His tiny hand gripped my finger with surprising strength, and in that moment, I felt as though my entire life had found its purpose. From then on, every overtime shift, every callus on my hands, every coin I tucked away was all for him. I missed birthdays. I missed Christmas mornings. I even missed Margaret's 50th birthday dinner because I was called in to unload a late shipment. I told myself it was worth it. Richard would go to a good school. He wouldn't have to sweat and bend his back as I did. He would be free to choose his path, to follow his dreams. And he did finance, university, a career in offices I couldn't even picture. He never had to carry ropes or crates. He wore suits instead of overalls. That was my gift to him. But gifts come with a price. My body bore the cost of those years. The doctors told me by the time I was 60 that my knees were worn down, that the arthritis creeping into my hands was the toll of a life spent carrying weight. They asked if I regretted it. I always said no. What's a bit of pain if it means your son has a future? That was the logic that kept me going. Margaret, she carried her own sacrifices. She wanted to travel. She often spoke of visiting Ireland, where her grandparents were from. She wanted to stand on the cliffs of Mahor to smell the wild Atlantic air. But the truth is, we never left England. We never had the money. Not once Richard was born. Every spare penny went into his education, his books, his school uniforms, and later his tuition fees. She would smile and say, "Someday, Elaine, someday, when things settle, we'll go." But things never settled. By the time we might have afforded it, her health had begun to fail. The dream remained a dream. Sometimes I wonder if Richard even knows how much we gave up for him. Does he remember the second-hand clothes Margaret mended so carefully, just so he wouldn't feel embarrassed at school? Does he know how many nights she stayed awake, sewing, cooking, stretching every bit of money to cover his needs? Or how many hours I spent bent double on the docks, fighting exhaustion just to bring home a few extra pounds? I don't think he does. Children rarely see the full picture of their parents' sacrifices, and perhaps they shouldn't. Perhaps that's part of the deal. You give everything so they don't have to think about it. But when that child grows into a man who decides you are too inconvenient to keep around, that's when the bitterness seeps in, because suddenly all those sacrifices feel invisible, erased as if they never happened. The silence of my house that night was filled with memories. I saw Richard's first steps across the faded carpet, Margaret clapping her hands in delight. I remembered the smell of roast beef on Sundays, the way we all crowded around the small dining table, laughing about nothing in particular. I remembered saving for months to buy Richard his first bicycle, and the way he rode it down the street, shouting with joy. Every sacrifice had led to those moments, and yet those same moments seemed to vanish when he stood in my living room and told me I needed to be placed in a home. How quickly love can turn into obligation. How easily memories can be pushed aside when they become inconvenient. That night, I pulled open the drawer of Margaret's old writing desk. Inside was her notebook, the one she used to jot down shopping lists and reminders. Tucked in the back was a note she had written to me years before she passed. Her handwriting was delicate but steady. "Elaine, you always give everything to everyone else. Promise me you'll keep something for yourself. Don't let them take it all. You deserve to have a piece of your own." Reading those words again brought tears to my eyes. I realized then that she had seen the truth long before I did. She knew that sacrifices, though noble, could leave a man hollow if no one ever recognized them. And she had given me permission, no, a command, to keep something for myself. I had, quietly, secretly. Richard never knew about the savings I had tucked away, bit by bit, over the years. He believed I had nothing, that I had spent every coin on him. In some ways, that was true. But Marguerite's voice had guided me. Keep something for yourself. And I had. That night, as the rain tapped against the window and the house groaned with age, I made a silent vow. The memories of what I gave up would not be wasted. They would not be forgotten. And one day, when the time was right, Richard would learn the truth. That sacrifices are not just stories of the past. They can become the seeds of a future he never expected. Silence has a way of changing shape. At first it feels like a heavy blanket thrown over you, suffocating and cold. But if you sit with it long enough, you begin to hear things you never noticed before. That was what I discovered in the days after Richard and his family walked out of my house in Manchester. The house had always been filled with sound. Margaret's laughter in the kitchen, Richard's footsteps racing down the hallway, the creak of the stairwell as I climbed it after a long shift at the docks. Even after Margaret passed, the house was rarely quiet. Richard would bring Emily over for Sunday lunch, or the neighbors would pop by for a chat. But once Richard decided that my life was no longer my own to manage, the noise disappeared. At first, I hated it. I would sit in my chair, staring at the muted glow of the television, not even listening to the programs. The silence pressed against me, reminding me of every absence, every person I had lost. The kettle whistling in the kitchen sounded like a scream. Even the clock on the mantel seemed cruel, each tick a reminder that I was counting down the hours in solitude. But something curious happened. The longer I sat with that silence, the less it felt like punishment, and the more it became a companion. There was honesty in it. People lie, words deceive, promises are broken, but silence it tells the truth, even when it hurts. In those days, I would wake early, before the city stirred. I'd sit at the window overlooking the narrow street, watching the fog roll through, like a ghost returning from the sea. I could hear the distant rumble of trains heading into Manchester Piccadilly, the muffled bark of a neighbor's dog, the shuffle of the postman's steps. Life was happening all around me, yet within these four walls, there was only me and the silence. And in that silence, memories began to surface. Not just the sacrifices I had made that I had already reflected on, but also the small, overlooked moments that used to fill my life with meaning. Margaret humming while she watered her roses. Richard asking me to check under his bed for monsters. Emily, as a child, painting my fingernails with her toy nail polish set and laughing until her belly ached. Those memories hurt, but they also kept me alive. They reminded me that once I was loved, not out of duty, not out of obligation, but genuinely loved. Silence gave me time to see things more clearly, to what I realized that Richard's words, the day he left, weren't just practical, they were dismissive. He didn't see me as a man anymore, not as a father, not as someone with agency. I had become, in his eyes, a liability to be managed, a file to be placed in someone else's cabinet. That realization stung worse than the silence itself. But instead of drowning me, it fueled me. I began to use the quiet like a tool. Each hour of solitude was a chance to plan, to think, to sharpen my resolve. Richard thought he was silencing me by isolating me, but silence became my teacher, my ally, my weapon. I started writing in a notebook, just a few lines each evening, recording my thoughts, my memories, and my intentions. Margaret used to write, and perhaps that's why it felt natural. In those pages, I didn't have to argue with anyone or defend myself. I simply told the truth, my truth. Some nights I wrote about the past, my first day at the docks, the way Margaret looked on our wedding day, the pride I felt watching Richard graduate. Other nights I wrote about the future, what I wanted to do with the savings Richard didn't know about, where I wanted my story to end, and how I wanted my silence to speak louder than any words I could utter to him. It was during one of those quiet evenings, with only the sound of rain pattering against the window, that I had a revelation. I didn't need to confront Richard. I didn't need to scream or demand recognition. I could let silence do the work. For me, there is no revenge sharper than the quiet unveiling of truth at the right time. A memory came to me then, one I hadn't thought of in years. Margaret and I had once attended a funeral for a neighbor. The man had lived a modest life, and everyone assumed he had nothing to his name. But when his will was read, it revealed donations to charities, gifts to friends, and letters he had written long ago, expressing gratitude and love. People were stunned. His silence in life had transformed into a voice after death. That memory planted a seed in me. The next morning, I walked into town, the chill of early spring biting at my cheeks. I went to the solicitor's office, the same one Margaret and I had used years ago. The secretary, a kind woman with glasses perched on her nose, looked surprised to see me. I sat in the solicitor's office for over an hour, rewriting my will. I didn't tell Richard. I didn't tell anyone. I walked back home with a quiet satisfaction blooming in my chest. The silence of my home no longer felt empty. It felt full of purpose. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock, reminded me that I was still here, still capable, still planning. Richard thought he had silenced me by removing his presence from my life. But in reality, he had freed me to think, to prepare, to let the stillness shape my revenge. That revenge, of course, wasn't born of malice. It wasn't about hatred. It was about balance. I had given everything to my family, my time, my body, my health, my dreams, and in the end, they had given me silence. So, I decided, silence would be my answer. When Emily visited once, briefly, on her own, she commented on how quiet the house was. "Granddad, don't you get lonely?" she asked, her voice softer than her parents'. I smiled and said, "Lonely? No, my dear, I've learned that silence isn't empty, it's full of answers." She looked at me strangely, not understanding. But one day, I knew she would. For now, the silence was mine, and I wore it like armor. It spoke for me, louder than Richard or Claire ever could. It whispered to me in the long hours of the night, "You are not defeated, you are preparing." And so, I sat in my chair, in the quiet of my Manchester home, letting the silence teach me patience, letting it sharpen my resolve, knowing that one day, when the time came, it would roar louder than any words I could ever speak. It is strange how the smallest sparks can ignite the greatest fires. For weeks after Richard and his family walked out, I lived surrounded by silence. That silence had stopped feeling like a punishment and instead became a kind of teacher. It forced me to think, to look at my life, not just as a series of events, but as a pattern. And one evening, as I sat at the old oak desk Margaret had used for years, I realized something. Perhaps silence wasn't just a companion. Perhaps silence could be a weapon. The thought didn't come to me all at once. It grew slowly, like ivy crawling up the wall of an old house. At first, it was only a feeling, a sense that I had been underestimated. Richard and Claire saw me as an old man, weak, incapable of shaping his own destiny. They thought that by making decisions for me, they had stripped me of choice. But choice still lived within me, tucked away like the savings I had hidden from their knowledge. That night, I pulled Margaret's notebook out of the drawer. I had taken to writing in it since she passed, not every day, but often enough that its pages were filled with fragments of me, hopes, regrets, half-finished thoughts. As I ran my fingers across her handwriting, the shopping lists, the reminders to pick up milk, the little notes she had left, I felt her presence again. It was as though she were whispering in my ear, urging me to see what was already in front of me. Her words returned to me. "Promise me you'll keep something for yourself. Don't let them take it all." That was when it struck me. My silence, my savings, my plans, these could become the shape of my revenge. Not the kind of revenge you read about in crime novels or watch in films. No shouting, no drama, no confrontation. No, my revenge would be quiet, silent, patient, and when it came, it would reveal more about them than it ever would about me. The next day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Manchester was as gray as ever, the clouds hanging low over the city. I wandered past the familiar streets, past the market stalls and the old pubs, until I found myself outside the Manchester Central Library. I hadn't stepped foot in that building for years, not since Margaret dragged me in to look at travel guides for Ireland we never bought. On a whim, I went inside. The warmth of the library wrapped around me, and the scent of books-old paper and dust was strangely comforting. I wandered aimlessly at first, letting my fingers brush against the spines of books, until one caught my eye. It was a collection of local stories, true accounts of men and women who had lived ordinary lives but left extraordinary legacies. I sat down at one of the heavy wooden tables and began to read. There was the story of a schoolteacher who, after her death, had left her modest savings to fund scholarships for children who could not afford tuition. Another tale told of a man who had worked quietly in a factory all his life but donated his entire estate to the local hospital. These people had never shouted about their intentions. They had never demanded recognition. But their silence had spoken volumes when the truth was revealed. That was when the seed became a plan. I realized I had something powerful, knowledge, that Richard didn't. He thought I was poor, dependent, fragile. He believed that every penny I ever earned had gone into raising him and keeping this house standing. But he was wrong. For decades, I had saved small amounts, tucked away from overtime shifts and careful budgeting, placed into accounts he knew nothing about. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to change the lives of others. Enough to remind Richard, one day, that the man he dismissed as useless had been anything but. The more I thought about it, the clearer the plan became. I would rewrite my will, not out of spite, but out of justice. Richard would expect to inherit everything this house, what little he assumed I had left, the relics of my life. He would believe it was his right, the natural order of things. But instead, he would find that I had left it all to those who had shown me kindness, to those who truly valued me, and to causes Margaret would have supported. The idea filled me with a strange kind of energy. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an old man, waiting for the end. I felt purposeful, alive. Of course, part of me wrestled with guilt. He was my son, after all. Was it cruel to deny him what he expected? Perhaps. But then I remembered his words. We can't always be here for you. We have our own lives, our own responsibilities. Those words had stripped me of dignity. They had reduced me to a problem to be solved. If he saw me only as a burden, then he had forfeited the right to benefit from all I had built. That evening, as I sat in my quiet living room, I spoke aloud, as if Margaret were sitting across from me in her favorite armchair. You always wanted me to stand up for myself, I said softly. Well, love, I think I finally will. The shadows on the walls seemed to nod their approval. From that moment on, my mind was set. I would let Richard believe he had silenced me, that I was simply drifting toward the end of my life without protest. But all the while, I would be weaving my plan in silence. And when the day came, when he least expected it, the truth would be revealed, not through my words, but through my actions. I went to bed that night with a calm I hadn't felt in years. As I lay there, listening to the wind rattle the window panes, I smiled. Revenge had been born not out of anger, but out of silence, patience, and love for Margaret, for myself, and even, in some twisted way, for Richard. Because sometimes, the greatest lesson you can give those who abandon you is not rage, but the quiet reminder that you were never as powerless as they believed. People often assume that dock workers like me lived from paycheck to paycheck, that every penny we earned went straight into keeping food on the table and lights in the house. And, truth be told, for a long time, that was exactly the case. When Richard was young and Margaret was alive, our wages disappeared almost as soon as they arrived. School uniforms, medical bills, heating during those brutal northern winters. We never had much, but we always had just enough. But Margaret, clever as she was, always whispered the same advice. Elaine, keep something for yourself, just a little, for the future. For the day when the world isn't as kind as it should be. At first, I didn't listen. How could I, when every extra pound seemed already spoken for? But after years at the docks, I noticed something. There were always odd jobs, extra shifts, last-minute calls when a shipment came in late at night. Those jobs paid a bit more, and most of the men spent the extra on beer or cards. I decided to do something different. I took Margaret's advice. Quietly, discreetly, I started to put a little aside. It began with just a few coins in a biscuit tin hidden at the back of the cupboard. Later, I opened a small savings account at the bank in Liverpool. I didn't tell Richard. I didn't tell anyone, not even Margaret, though I suspect she knew. She had a way of noticing things without needing to ask. Sometimes, when she smiled at me over her cup of tea, I felt she was smiling at the secret we both shared, even if it had never been spoken aloud. Over the decades, that small effort grew. Nothing spectacular, nothing anyone would brag about, but steady, reliable, a bit from every overtime shift. A few pounds tucked away when we managed to stretch the weekly budget just a little thinner. By the time Richard went off to university, the account was no longer small. It wasn't wealth, not by the standards of bankers and lawyers, but for a dock worker from Liverpool, it was something to be proud of, and I never touched it. Not once. Even when Margaret got sick, even when the bills piled up, I left that money where it was. I told myself it was for an emergency though. If I am honest, I think part of me always knew it was also a test to see if I could give everything and still keep one corner of my life just for myself. When Margaret passed away, I sat in the quiet of our bedroom and thought about that money. For a moment, I considered using it then. Maybe to finally take that trip to Ireland she always dreamed of, even if it meant going alone. But grief has a way of paralyzing you. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing those cliffs without her hand in mine. So the money remained untouched. Years passed. Richard grew successful in his career. He never once asked me if I needed help, never once offered to pay back any of what I had given him. He assumed, I think, that I had nothing, that I had spent every drop of my strength and every coin of my wages on raising him. And in a way, I had. But not entirely. When he stood in my living room that day and told me it was time to move into a home, when he looked at me with pity instead of respect, I realized that my secret savings had a purpose greater than I had ever imagined. They would be the foundation of my revenge. I began to plan carefully. I went to the bank in Leeds one afternoon, an old branch with marble floors and tellers who still smiled at you as if you were human. I sat down with the manager, a polite woman with kind eyes, and asked her to review my accounts. She explained everything patiently, and I listened, nodding, though my mind was racing ahead. That evening, back at home, I opened Margaret's desk and spread out the papers in front of me. Bank statements, passbooks, letters. My savings weren't astronomical, but they were more than enough to make a difference. Enough to show Richard that the man he dismissed as poor and weak had quietly built a life of independence. Enough to leave behind a legacy, not of bitterness, but of justice. I decided that the money would go in 3 directions. First, to people who had shown me kindness in ways Richard never did. The neighbors who checked in on me when Margaret passed. The young lad from the corner shop who always carried my groceries to the door. These were small gestures, perhaps, but they mattered. Second, I would leave part of it to my new circle of friends, the retirees I met later in York, people who valued companionship over obligation. And third, and most importantly, I would donate a large portion to a children's hospital in London, in Margaret's name. She had always loved children, and though she never got the chance to see Emily grow into the woman she became, she would have wanted her memory tied to helping others. The idea filled me with something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Not the power of youth, not the strength of muscles honed at the docks, but a quieter power. The power of choice, the power of control. Richard thought he had stripped that away from me. He thought I was helpless, voiceless, dependent. But I wasn't. I had been preparing for this moment my entire life, without even realizing it. In the weeks that followed, I lived my days much the same as before. I brewed my tea in the mornings, walked to the shops when the weather allowed, sat in my chair in the evenings, with the radio humming softly in the background. But beneath that ordinary surface, I was working, making calls, signing papers, writing letters, crafting a legacy that would outlast Richard's disappointment and Claire's disapproval. Every time I thought of Richard's words, "We can't always be here for you," I felt a calm satisfaction. He was right. They weren't here for me, but they didn't need to be. I had been here for myself all along. And when the day came, he would learn just how much I had kept hidden, how much strength I still had, even in silence. The secret savings weren't just money. They were proof. Proof that a man can give everything to his family and still keep one small, unbreakable part of himself. Proof that silence, patience, and careful planning can outlast even betrayal. And as I tucked the papers back into Margaret's desk, I whispered to her, "You were right, love. I kept something for myself. And soon, he'll know it." After Richard and Claire pushed me into that care home in York, I felt like the world had ended. My house in Leeds, the walls Margaret and I painted together, the garden where Emily once played, in their place, a small room with beige curtains and a bed that smelled faintly of disinfectant. I told myself it was temporary, that perhaps they would realize how wrong they were. But deep down, I knew this was their way of discarding me, like an old coat no longer useful for winter. For the first weeks, I barely spoke to anyone. Meals were eaten in silence. I'd sit in the corner of the dining hall, watching other residents chatter like they'd known each other for years. I told myself I wasn't like them. I didn't belong. They had given in. I was still fighting, but something changed. One morning in the lounge, I was reading the Yorkshire Post, pretending to be more interested in the football scores than in the noise around me, when an old man with a crooked smile sat down beside me. "You follow Leeds United, then?" he asked, tapping the paper. I gave him a short nod. "Since I was a boy." "Good, means you know how to suffer." He laughed, a dry, crackling sound that somehow made me smile. His name was Arthur Bennett, a retired bus driver from Sheffield. Within minutes, he was telling me about the passengers he used to ferry students, sneaking cigarettes, couples arguing, old ladies who always sat in the same seat. He had a way of making ordinary memories feel like stories worth telling. That was the beginning. Soon, Arthur introduced me to two others: Miriam Clark, a widow from York who'd been a school teacher, and Douglas Harris, a former Royal Navy engineer. They'd formed a little group, meeting each afternoon for tea and conversation. And Arthur simply pulled me into it as if I'd always been there. At first, I listened more than I spoke. But gradually, I found myself sharing stories too, about the docks in Liverpool, about Margaret, about the nights when fog rolled in so thick you couldn't see the water even while standing on the pier. They listened with a patience I hadn't known in years. No interruptions, no sighs of inconvenience, no looking at their watches, just attention, respect. It surprised me how much I began to look forward to those afternoons. In that sterile, controlled environment, friendship grew like wildflowers, pushing through cracks in the pavement. Miriam, especially, reminded me of Margaret in certain ways. She had the same sharp wit, the same habit of correcting your grammar when you least expected it. One afternoon, when Arthur was rambling about a football match in 1973, she leaned toward me and whispered, "He's told this story at least a dozen times. You'll get used to it." I nearly laughed out loud. Douglas was quieter, but he had a depth to him. Once, when I mentioned Richard's betrayal, Douglas simply placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Families can wound deeper than war." Coming from a man who had seen combat, that sentence carried more weight than any sermon I'd ever heard. For the first time since Margaret's death, I didn't feel entirely alone. But it wasn't just companionship I found. With these new friends, I also discovered clarity. I began to speak of my plan carefully at first, hinting at how I wanted to ensure my legacy went somewhere meaningful. Arthur leaned forward, with eyes shining. "You've got something saved, don't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Enough to make a difference. I don't want it going to Richard after what he's done." Arthur slapped his knee. "Good man. About time someone taught the young that the old aren't fools." Miriam, ever practical, said, "You'll need proper advice, solicitors, witnesses, everything in writing, airtight. Don't give him a chance to twist it." Douglas, who rarely spoke at length, murmured, "Make sure it honors Margaret. That's what will give you peace." Their words struck me. They weren't just friends now. They had become my counsel, my allies. The more we spoke, the clearer the plan became. I began to draft letters, to make appointments, to think not of despair, but of justice. Life in that care home changed in subtle ways. Where once I saw only beige walls, now I saw opportunities. Where once I felt discarded, now I felt reborn. I wasn't the man they had abandoned. I was the man quietly preparing his final act. One afternoon, we sat in the garden outside, the sun setting over York Minster's distant spires, and Arthur raised his cup of tea. "To us," he said, "the forgotten ones who refuse to be forgotten." We all clinked our cups together, and I felt a swell of pride. Forgotten, perhaps by Richard and Claire, but not by the people who mattered. Not by those who chose to see me, not for what I lacked, but for what I still carried within me. And as I returned to my room that evening, I realized something else. My revenge wasn't just about teaching Richard a lesson. It was also about showing myself that even in old age, even after loss and betrayal, life could surprise me. That bonds could still be formed, laughter could still be shared, trust could still be earned, in the unlikeliest of places, surrounded by strangers who became family. I had found the strength to finish what I had started, The care home was supposed to be my cage. Instead, it became my workshop, my fortress, the place where silence turned into strategy and loneliness into loyalty. They thought they had buried me there, but in truth, it was there that I began to rise. The idea came to me late one night. I was sitting at the small desk in my room at the care home, the lamp casting a yellow glow on the paper in front of me. My hand shook not from age, though that played its part, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I was about to put into words the decision that would alter everything, the fate of my savings, the meaning of my years of labor, and the legacy of my name. For weeks, Arthur, Miriam, and Douglas had encouraged me to think carefully. Make it clear, make it final, Miriam said more than once. A letter can be burned, but a will, that's iron. Still, before anything legal could happen, I needed words, a declaration, something that would say, once and for all, that I would not be used. So I began, to whomever it may concern, I, Elaine Walker, being of sound mind, do hereby declare my intentions regarding my estate and the people who have shaped my final years. This is not merely about money, but about dignity, respect, and truth. At first, the words spilled slowly, but soon they came in waves, as though Margaret herself was guiding my pen. I wrote about my life, the years spent on the docks, the sacrifices made for Richard, the way I'd stood by him even when he faltered. And then I wrote about the betrayal, how he and Claire had taken my trust and twisted it into convenience, discarding me like yesterday's paper. But I didn't stop at bitterness. I wrote about Arthur, who reminded me that laughter could still be found even when one felt forgotten. About Miriam, whose sharp tongue was a shield of wisdom. About Douglas, who had taught me that scars, be they from war or family, could still carry honor. I wrote that my savings, modest though they were, would not go to Richard or Claire. Instead, I would set up a fund, a scholarship, in Margaret's name, for students in Leeds who dreamed of studying maritime engineering. It felt fitting. The docks had given me my livelihood, and perhaps, through this fund, they could give someone else their beginning. But I wasn't done. The letter was not just about legacy. It was about confrontation. I addressed Richard directly. To my son, Richard Walker, you will look for your inheritance in my death as you looked for convenience in my life. You will find nothing. What you failed to give me, respect, loyalty, compassion, you shall not receive from me in return. You turned your back on me, but I will not leave you the satisfaction of profiting from my absence. My silence has not been ignorance. It has been preparation. When I wrote those last words, a chill ran through me. Preparation. That was exactly what it had been. Months of sitting quietly in the care home, letting them believe I was finished, while in truth I was sharpening the blade of my decision. When the letter was done, I folded it carefully and slipped it into an envelope, but I didn't seal it right away. For several nights, I left it on the desk, reading it again and again, testing the weight of every sentence. Each time I read it, the anger softened, and something else grew in its place. Peace, not forgiveness, not quite, but peace in knowing that my life's meaning wouldn't be buried in Richard's pockets. Finally, one morning after tea with Arthur and the others, I sealed the envelope. Miriam watched me slip it into my jacket. Big step, she asked, her eyes narrowing. The biggest, I said. She nodded. Then make sure it's not just paper. Take it to a solicitor. Let it breathe in law, not just in ink. So that afternoon, with Douglas accompanying me like a silent guardian, I walked into a solicitor's office in York. The young man behind the desk, barely 30, with hair too neat to be trusted, looked at me as if I were just another old man fussing about money. But when I slid the letter across his desk and explained my intentions, his face grew serious. You want to set up a scholarship fund in your late wife's name? He asked. Yes, I replied firmly, and I want it ironclad. My son is not to touch a penny of it. If he contests it, I want it written in such a way that the court laughs him out the door. The solicitor nodded, scribbling notes. We can make that happen. It will require some paperwork. Witnesses, I have friends, I interrupted. They'll stand with me. Arthur and Miriam were only too happy to act as witnesses. They signed the documents with pride, as though they were co-authors of my decision. When the solicitor stamped the final page, I felt something shift inside me, a chain breaking. That night, back in my room, I sat by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt powerful, not because of money, but because I had taken control of my story. The letter was more than a will. It was a declaration of independence, written in the twilight of my life. Richard and Claire had thought they'd silenced me by placing me in that care home. But the truth was, they had given me the perfect setting to write the ending on my own terms. I could almost hear Margaret's voice then, soft and approving. "Well done, Elaine. Well done." And in that moment, I knew the letter had changed everything. Not just for Richard, not just for the students who would one day hold Margaret's name in their scholarship certificates, but for me. I was no longer the man discarded. I was the man who had the final word. I always believed that death reveals more about the living than the dead. A man can spend his whole life unnoticed, but when he is gone, the way others respond tells the truth of how they really saw him. I didn't know exactly how Richard and Claire would react to my passing, but deep down, I suspected their grief would be measured not in tears, but in bank statements. I was right. When the day came, it was quiet. I had grown weaker in the final weeks, my body betraying me in small, stubborn ways. The shaking of my hands, the shortness of my breath, the ache that lingered even in stillness. Yet, I did not fear it. I had made my preparations. The letter, the will, the scholarship pit was all in place. My silent revenge was already breathing, ready to live long after I was gone. Arthur was by my side that last morning. He held my hand, the way men of our generation rarely did, and told me not to be afraid. Miriam sat in the chair by the window, her sharp eyes softened for once. Douglas stood quietly near the door, as though guarding me from something unseen. I smiled at them all, whispering my thanks, and then I drifted, slowly, into the kind of sleep that does not end. What followed, I cannot describe from within, only from what I was told later by those who cared. The care home arranged a simple service I had requested. Nothing grand, just a modest gathering in Leeds. Margaret's favorite hymn was played, and for a moment I imagined her voice rising above the rest. My friends from the home came, staff members came, even a few old neighbors from our street. But Richard and Claire, they came. Yes, but not for me. I had left instructions for the solicitor to deliver my will immediately after the service. Richard, I'm told, arrived with his usual hurried air, as though he were already late for something more important. Claire, ever calculating, sat stiffly, her lips pressed tight. They looked uncomfortable, not because of grief, but because of the stairs. Everyone there could see the distance between us, the way a son should grieve for his father but did not. When the solicitor stood and began to read, the silence in the room grew heavy. He read my words slowly, clearly, each sentence a stone thrown into the still water of that hall. Richard shifted uncomfortably when my voice captured in ink addressed him directly. You will look for your inheritance in my death as you looked for convenience in my life. You will find nothing. Those in the room later said the color drained from his face. Claire's jaw tightened, and her hand gripped his arm as though to keep him seated. They endured the words as though each one were a lash about my disappointment, my awareness of their betrayal, my decision to place every penny into a scholarship fund in Margaret's name. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse, just silence. That, I think, was worse for them. Silence reveals shame more clearly than noise ever could. After the reading, Miriam told me later, Richard stormed out, muttering under his breath about nonsense and being robbed. Claire followed quickly, her heels clicking like hammers against the floor. They left without speaking to anyone, without laying a flower, without a backward glance at the coffin that carried their father. But others stayed. They stayed and spoke kindly of me. They spoke of Margaret, of her laugh, of the way we had once danced in the square on a summer's night. They spoke of my years at the docks, of my stubbornness, of my loyalty. And when the hymn played again, they sang not for Richard's benefit, not for Claire's approval, but for me, for Elaine Walker, the man they knew, not the one forgotten by his son. And then the scholarship fund was announced. Within weeks, news spread across Leeds, a maritime scholarship in the name of Margaret Walker, funded by the savings of an old dockworker who wanted the future to shine brighter for young engineers. Letters began to arrive at the solicitor's office, from students, from parents, from teachers. They wrote about dreams, about ambition, about the chance this fund would give them. My friends read some of those letters aloud at the care home. Arthur's voice cracked as he read the words of a young woman who wanted to design ships for the Royal Navy. Miriam wiped a tear from her cheek as she listened to a boy who dreamed of building vessels that could carry aid across seas to those in need. That was my legacy. That was my revenge. Richard tried, of course. He went to the solicitor, demanded answers, threatened to contest the will. But the will was ironclad. Every phrase, every clause had been sharpened like a blade, and with Arthur and Miriam as witnesses, his case was laughable. The solicitor told him plainly, "Your father made his wishes clear. There is nothing for you here." He left the office enraged, his pride wounded more than his pockets. But that was the point. Money fades, pride festers. As for me, though gone, I had found peace. My silent revenge had unfolded not in bitterness, but in purpose. Richard and Claire would remember me not as a weak old man they tucked away, but as the father who, with his last breath, denied them the satisfaction of winning. But beyond vengeance, I had built something greater. My name, Margaret's name, would live on in the hands of young dreamers. Each time a student received that scholarship, each time a ship sailed, designed by their hands, a piece of me would be there, not as the forgotten father, but as the man who refused to be erased. I had no need to shout, no need to curse, no need to fight. My silence had been enough. My preparation had been my weapon. My letter had been my blade, and my legacy our legacy. Margaret's and mine was the victory. Yes, they abandoned me. Yes, they thought me weak, irrelevant, finished. But they forgot one small truth. Even the quietest man can craft a thunderous ending. And in the end, that is exactly what I did.